The concept of open science continues to gather speed, a movement dedicated to making science more collaborative, transparent, and accessible to all. But how do we align this mission with ownership and competition across academia and industry? My guest today is the Chief Operating Officer and Managing Director of the Center for Open Science. With a career spanning strategic leadership, scientific publishing, and social impact, she is guiding initiatives that can bring a new level of integrity to research and reshape the culture of science that can be to everyone's benefit. This is the Discovery Arc podcast. I am Drew Douglin, and today, let us welcome Lisa Cuevas Shaw. Lisa, we were just talking about a decade of open science, and maybe we can start with what is open science, and I guess what isn't open science, and what are some of the misconceptions there?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks, Drew. I'm happy to talk about that. I think open science, for me, is a term that is used to describe this broader reform movement across the research system to improve the way that science is done and also the way that science is rewarded. And I think that's an important piece that we'll probably end up coming back to. But in essence, it is sharing all different parts of the research process and of research that are traditionally not shared, at least as far as possible in terms of privacy and other things. And the reform movement itself involves researchers, obviously, they're at the heart of the movement, but it involves private and governmental funders, academic institutions, scholarly societies, and of course, citizens who are interested in making the research process open and accessible for a range of reasons and motivations. Some of those are just the general belief and understanding, and more evidence is building that open and reusable science can accelerate innovations and discoveries and solve problems faster. So I think most of us who are part of this reform movement feel strongly that is the case, but we also have to continue to prove that is the case as well. Also, that access to science and to knowledge should be equitable, that making science more transparent will lead to less wasted research. So when you have things in the proverbial, they call it the file drawer, people doing things that have been tried and have failed before, or studies that could have been vastly improved, that's a waste. So we can, by making things open, avoid some of those circumstances. And then relatedly, just on the note of reward systems, it's a movement that is intending to acknowledge that we shouldn't just be rewarding the positive or new discoveries or novel findings, right? That good research should be rewarded and can contribute either in the short term or in the longer term to greater discovery. So some of the misconceptions, I think, of open science are that it is about just opening up everything, right? And kind of throwing out the window some good practice around science, obviously, consent of folks who are involved in studies, privacy, confidentiality. There's a phrase that shows up quite a bit in UNESCO's recommendation on open science that is as open as it is possible and as closed as necessary. And so I think the open science community understands that, but there are some challenges with that too, in terms of some of the boundaries and such. So.
Yeah, so much to talk about there. When did you actually first come across open science?
Yeah, my first involvement in open science was I was exposed to certain facets of it while working for Sage Publishing. So that's a rather large independent scholarly publisher who produces academic journals, textbooks, and other tools and resources. And when I worked with Sage, I was exposed to the open access movement. So that's kind of a certain facet or a subset of the broader open science movement. And open access defines a set of principles and kind of a range of practices through which research outputs are distributed online, free of access charges or other barriers. So that was kind of my first entree into it, but it's such a, it's a kind of narrow aspect of open science, or it's one aspect of open science. But I really got ensconced in open science as kind of global movement when doing my doctoral work. And that was actually late stage. So I had about 20 years of professional experience under my belt, and was one of those folks who decided I would like to go back, crazy me. And it was a program, kind of an interdisciplinary program that really focused on global leadership, change, all of that. And so I elected to study the open science movement from the perspective of leadership, from systems theory, and how global norms, in this case, the research within the research system, are adopted at scale. And so I started to study various aspects of this reform movement. And my dissertation work looked specifically at the UNESCO initiative to develop a recommendation for open science. So kind of got really, really ensconced in all of that from so many different facets, and haven't looked back. So.
Were you always interested in science, like before that? So what were your kind of career aspirations?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of fell into academic publishing. I was an English major, and everyone always asked, "Are you going to teach? Are you going to become a journalist?" I tried the journalist route for about a minute, and actually enjoyed it. But to be honest, the opportunity to join Sage Publishing kind of fell in my lap. Sage's headquarters is right in my backyard. And so landed a position there where I literally was supporting the production of scholarly journals, like literally the copy editing, designing, proofreading, all of that, and enjoyed that, but also started to be exposed to more of the editorial and business development aspects of publishing. And so I got the opportunity to work with book authors, textbook authors, and moved to publishing professional development books, courses, and all of that. And I didn't, I'm surprised that I, lasted with the first veritable job for as long as I did, but I just got very lucky because I've loved ideas. I've loved shaping them, curating them, assembling a portfolio of knowledge. I mean, that sounds a little bit privileged, but being a part of that process, I think I have loved the challenge of trying to make knowledge more widely accessible and applicable in different kind of use cases, and also found that I loved the relationship with authors and people who wanted to kind of spread knowledge or construct knowledge together. So my aspirations were really, I found kind of a home in that community. And then I think from a leadership perspective, I was just very lucky to be afforded the opportunity to work with people and manage people and teams and different things pretty early on. And those were kind of pivotal moments for me personally, to be able to understand that looking outside of myself and my self-interests really comes to light when you're kind of responsible for a team, and making sure that you're creating an environment, or helping to create an environment where folks can grow and develop. So my bigger aspirations really ended up being about trying to be, I'll say, the best leader. I don't even want to confer that title on myself, but if I'm in a position of leadership, that I am creating an environment where people can thrive.
Yeah. Did you think you might be a book author at the time?
It's on the list still, actually. Haven't done it. I know how hard it is. But yeah, I think that it's an amazing journey. It's, having completed a dissertation, I probably would liken it to that. A little different, but yeah, I mean, and it's inspiring to see some of these, some authors, many authors are just incredibly prolific, dedicated, disciplined. It takes a lot, and it can be kind of an isolating and lonely process too. And folks have a lot of resilience, but it's a rewarding journey if you've got kind of the right either information or story to tell.
Yeah, and you've got such an interesting background there with the publishing space, and I definitely want to talk about the openness of that. But maybe before that, what are the different pillars of open science practices that you see, and how do the sort of scientists and I guess the public contribute to that?
Yeah, I think there's a few different ways to look at that. So, the different aspects of open science practices, maybe we'll start with the broad categories of open science. And I usually draw on, I would recommend for anyone who's interested in it to draw on the UNESCO recommendation for open science. It's very broad, but I think it's a good place to start because it really tries to encapsulate the multiple components of it. So the big categories are really just about open scientific knowledge itself. So you have scientific publications, open research data, open educational resources, open source software and source code, open hardware as well. So that's just in the knowledge domain. You also have the broad category of open science infrastructure. So, literally, the physical and virtual infrastructure that can support opening up science and kind of the reuse of science. There's another element, and the two that are more really around engagement and dialogue, right? So, you have open engagement with society. So, you could have crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, scientific volunteering, and then more on the citizen and participatory science. So that's another broad category. And then lastly, just the dialogue component itself. So making sure that it's not just about access and openness, but that we're engaging with one another and with different types of knowledge systems. So whether it's indigenous peoples, marginalized scholars, or local communities and local and global, and that dynamic as well. So I like to think of all those things as kind of open science more broadly cast. But when you come down to identifying actually the practices of open science, they are things like what you would do if you're formulating a study, you to register it and actually tell folks, be able to openly say, this is what I'm planning to do. Even if it's exploratory research, laying out what your intentions are, any theories you may have, or the direction that you're headed. In some cases, it's appropriate to be able to also document your study protocol and your analysis plan and make that available. And what's challenging for folks is, again, research is a messy process. It's a hard process. And so the concept of like making all those things that might be imperfect, right, openly available and having them like time stamped, this is what it was, is scary. And we're not taught to kind of to go into it that way. We're ultimately, even globally, kind of more culturally, we expect so much level of certainty of our scientists, right? So it's tough. And then materials transparency, data transparency, code transparency, and then reporting on your outputs. So all of those really support transparency and openness across the research lifecycle.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we talked about sort of the software and code, and I know at Sage Bionetworks, like we're talking a lot about that balance, right, between open as possible, but when you're dealing with sensitive data, it has to be with the right ethical approach, responsible openness. How are you seeing sort of the similarities and differences when comparing open science practices to that sort of open source push we sort of see in the tech space?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it has a lot of similar facets to it, right? I mean, you've got to be responsible and think about who you're serving all along the way. And so ideally, they're just good practices about considering others' motivations, who's going to use things. I mean, stuff that comes up certainly in both open science and open source is just dual use purposes, the kind of more nefarious things that you do have to think about. There needs to be a process and a methodology for that. The other thing that comes up, kind of across open science, open innovation, open source, is just, the potential commercialization aspects and some different motivations as well. And I don't, I think we're able to have space for all of that, but being able to also draw on and determine what should really be a public good and why. I think having more conversations around that with the public at large as well, not just kind of, folks who are really steeped in it, would be important, because that might also open up some broader understanding of what the issues are, right? I mean, that certainly comes into play with like AI. I know there's a lot of interest obviously in AI, and it's like, well, who's going to be controlling, if you will, or monitoring those algorithms and like determining the levels of bias that might exist on, the training data, all the things, right? And shouldn't some of these things be public goods that are monitored by the community or governed by the community? So there's a lot packed in there, a lot of different and interesting issues that we'll continue to grapple with, but hopefully have some really good open dialogue around.
Yeah, I know that public good discussion has been definitely a big one in terms of the social media companies, right? Because this is the main way we all communicate now, get our news, whatever it is. It's all through some of these, ever smaller numbers of dominating platforms. So yeah, that is tough. Yeah.
Yeah,
How
indeed.
how do you sort of see the metrics around open science? Like how across those different pillars, how do we measure how open science is occurring? Like how do we gauge the impact it's having and the degree of openness, I guess, or success?
Yeah, it comes back for me to some of the motivations we talked about at the outset. I mean, in terms of measuring maybe success in open science, it's how much research and data is made openly available. Did we see an increase in quality and efficiency? How much is reusable? So do we have all the information needed to reuse protocols, plans, data, code? Did we reduce waste, and how do we know? So is there evidence of a reduction in wasted effort? Did we increase innovation and discovery? Did we increase equity? And that's something that I am aware of some research studies and kind of initiatives to really take a look at, are we increasing equity in terms of access and contribution to knowledge, and what does that look like? How do we know? So I think that's a big piece of it. And then ultimately, I mean, the biggie, and this will take some time because there's a lot of different things going on to kind of undermine it potentially, but did we increase trust and accountability in the scholarly endeavor? So those are all, then you get into the real granularity of like, no, but exactly how would you measure that? And there's a lot of work that certainly can go into that, but a lot of people are doing some good work. I think what I've seen most recently in the last few years is just increasing investment of time and effort just in actually measuring the prevalence of open science indicators. So seeing that on more of a global scale, but some regional initiatives and different things. And coming back to UNESCO, one of the things that came out of their recommendation on open science was just a lot of conversation about, it's nice that you have this recommendation, but how are we going to monitor who's actually committed? We've all, the General Assembly, the United Nations General Assembly, all 192 or whatever member states signed off on this. How will we actually monitor that we're advancing this commitment? And so, to UNESCO's credit, this is something that, again, as a intergovernmental organization, there isn't a lot that they can kind of, drive, right, in terms of carrots and sticks and all of that. But to their credit, they are establishing a monitoring mechanism whereby, and they just spoke at our Year of Open Science conference to confirm that the General Assembly had approved the fact that they'll conduct some national surveys and ask all of the member states to offer an update on open science. And that may have a range of, what are the initiatives, but also my hope is that it's going to start to drive just actually measuring the prevalence of open science. And then by that, we will have other scientists who will probably pick up some of those data points and really continue to pursue, are we seeing an increase in innovation and discovery, trust, accountability, equity, quality, efficiency, all those things. So it's such a multi-level, kind of issue, but I see activity across those levels too, which is encouraging.
Yeah, I was thinking because open science is international in its scope there. So, how do you feel like we're doing here? Are there policies or cultures in other countries where you feel like it's being done better or indeed worse?
Yeah, I don't know about worse. I mean, it's kind of a little bit all over the map, and sometimes it's a resourcing issue, like
Mm.
veritable resourcing issues, different things, or having champions in the right institutional settings and all of that. I think in the US, United States, in the last few years, it feels like there is building momentum. So the federal policy landscape has certainly started to accelerate the adoption of open science. Certainly, National Institutes of Health, just even coming off of the year of open science with 17 of the agencies signing on and making a commitment to that. The OSTP memo, the Nelson memo, talking about public access, those types of things. There's a building commitment and requirement to have an implementation plan, which is looking really good, but implementation is really hard too. So it's going to take quite a bit of effort just to realize, what we're hoping for from that. I think from our perspective, we see a lot of advancement in the European space as well. So there's been quite a commitment for some time. But again, there's still some messiness there as well in terms of joining up regional strategies and such. I think some of the opportunities that certainly I see in Africa as well, focus on I would say probably heavily focused still on open access and maybe infrastructure, but really also offering some different lenses in terms of, kind of community management, provenance, those types of things as well. So I see a lot of encouraging signs. Definitely feels like in the past at least 5 years, it's accelerating. So it's almost I might be in a little bit of an echo chamber. I mean, this is, what I live and breathe. And so I like to think about that too. But there are a lot of signals that the momentum is building. And so it's not like, we're going to still face some challenges regarding rewards and incentives and that type of thing. But talking about open science has become just so much more prevalent. So even at the Center for Open Science, while we are still huge advocates for it, and that's a lot of our effort, we're actually spending more time on the actual implementation, from policy to implementation and research practices themselves. So that's really encouraging as well.
Yeah, and since you've been the director there, what are some of the big successes that kind of stick out to you, either across the landscape, across certain initiatives, across certain disciplines, perhaps?
Yeah, yeah, I think it's really encouraging. I mentioned the U.S. policy landscape. I think we're pretty excited about some of the milestone work that's happened in the past few years. From an infrastructure perspective, so by that I mean just the technology itself to enable open science and connected research. It seems to me that we've got greater collaboration among infrastructure providers to work together towards what we call interoperability. So we're not trying to, the center um, develops the open science framework, which is a tool to allow researchers to be able to practice open science across their research projects and initiatives, kind of across the research life cycle. And we never we don't want folks to only use the open science framework. We want to be able to essentially connect into the ecosystem and be as efficient and as effective as possible. And so the notion of interoperability, connectedness of infrastructure to make outputs more seamless is really exciting, and there's more effort there, even among commercial players in that space too. I think the technology capabilities are getting stronger. It's just it's a lot of work. But I think the things that excite me the most tend to be the grassroots efforts where you see either disciplinary communities coming together or methodological communities, so folks who focus specifically on qualitative research or certain types of methods. That's where you kind of see the purest enactment of the values of science. There's like high degree of collaboration, coordination, credit where credit is due, collective good versus personal interest, and it's really really amazing. And then I mentioned UNESCO and its open science team. It's a small team for considering what they do, but they need to be commended for sustaining their implementation efforts after getting buy-in from the member states on the recommendations. It's not easy, and again, UNESCO's like sitting really up high, trying to kind of support, the broader global norms development, but they really have continued at it to try to develop opportunities for diversity and equity and inclusiveness of open science, and also that monitoring aspect. So I'm pretty excited about all those things.
Yeah.
Disciplinary wise, you mentioned, it's a great question. I mean, there are some disciplines where it's just not become normative yet. And so, even some of the clinical science aspects and, then when you get into pharma and, there's just so much packed in there that makes it a little bit challenging, but we're seeing more uptake on the social behavioral sciences, physical sciences as well. I think that's become a little bit more normative, at least in scientists publishing preprints as well. So, rather than just finished articles, like serving up the outputs of their research in preprint format is pretty exciting and continues to, I think, gain a little bit of momentum as well.
Yeah. Okay. Let's delve into that and this issue of publishing, because you have such a great background here. And, I feel like the growth of, open access journals, preprints is happening. But at the same time, some people see sort of the publishers as like the guard and the barrier against, scientific knowledge through for access to papers. So, where do you see the publishing space going now into the future with this drive for openness, and how far has it kind of come since you got involved in Sage publishing, maybe?
Yeah, it's come a long way, and I will be very, very honest that I still have quite a split brain about this, or like reconciling my own like value system, and I was very fortunate because I think Sage is, my big part of my career was with Sage, and they're a good actor in this space. I mean, I lived it. They're very, at the core, the founder, Sarah McCune, was really social justice oriented and all of that. And publishers, and specifically commercial publishers, are often pitted as like, these gatekeepers, and why isn't research actually in the hands of the community, where it should be? That's where the gatekeeping should be held. And to a large degree, I mean, I agree with that. And actually publishers try to facilitate that through editorial boards and, confirm understanding that the expertise lies with the scholarly community. And then trying to work to make sure there's inclusive practices and all of that. But yes, I mean, I think the biggest tension point is really comes down to the economics of it, and the financial, the profit, the potential for profit versus, public good type of things. I think that it's changed a lot in the last decade in terms of open access. I don't think we're there yet in terms of sustainable models. So there needs to be even more experimentation with that. But it's just kind of this whole problem of shifting the burden. Is it the funder that pays, for the publication process? Even if it were owned by the community, peer review is free labor right now. Like there's so many layers of things that are kind of drawing out the economic burden of producing excellent science and then disseminating it and curating it. So the answer is not easy, but a lot has changed. And so I'm encouraged by that. I think publishers have plenty of value add that they, in terms of thinking about what they might do in the future. If journals, we can get into a discussion about why everything anchors on journals, by the way, because actually my hope is that we would be rewarding data outputs or protocols, or the registered reports model is an example of where we'd certainly like to see things where the reward for the researcher is not anchored on the paper, and getting published. It's really about good research. So that has to fundamentally change. If that changes, the publishers will still have an opportunity to curate collections or support the translation of research to apply to different domains, different facets of life that will help, in other discovery and mechanisms. So I think there's a place for everybody. I just think the rub that we have not solved for is the economic burden and kind of those feelings of competing interests of profit versus public good. So that's one I haven't solved, but have been thinking a lot about in terms of how do we sustain the effort and how do we reward the effort too.
Yeah, what was that last thing you mentioned? Was it research registries?
Registered reports. So this is a model, a publishing model that essentially it's a twofer for scientists or researchers, authors, where a journal would essentially evaluate an analysis plan, so your study plan, and commit to, or protocol, and commit to publishing that. And then regardless of the outcome, would make an in principle commitment to publish the paper thereafter, the findings thereafter. So you'd essentially get two publications, so based on the current reward system, that's kind of a nice intermediary model, because it rewards the scholar for just the analysis plan or the methodological plan itself. And then also what studies have shown, and I don't remember the exact study, but it was not that long ago, demonstrated that the registered reports model does reduce positive bias. So in other words, only reporting on positive findings. So you do see null results, things that it didn't work out the way that I thought. You see those produced, and that's great. That's wonderful. We should actually celebrate that, but we don't. So that's the model that essentially supports that. And the evidence is clear that it actually does increase the null findings report.
Yeah, what you said rings so true, because there is that strong bias, isn't there, between positive versus negative, and all the highly sought after research is one that has this sensational positive result, and it's like the rigor of the research, even if it brings out a negative result, should get credit. And it's so frustrating. And I have thought for a while about, is there not this push to have certain journals that might just report null results? I mean, does that exist? I mean, is that would that be not a success?
That's actually, I feel like there is one out there. You're now going to prompt me to look it up, but I'm pretty sure. And yeah, that I think there are a lot of folks who would support that as well. So we're working on it. But that model in particular, I believe there's well over at least 300, is probably higher than that, journals that accept the registered reports model, which is great.
Yeah, that's such a cool idea. And then in terms of, going back to the wider issue of getting commercial players on board, how is this just openness more broadly reconciled with this issue of intellectual property or competition and funding opportunities? How do we change that culture, and what are some of the approaches there that might be successful or are being implemented?
Yeah, I think we've seen the rights retention for authors really also pushed to the fore. And that's something that certainly when I started in publishing and was even trained, to try to retain that copyright, right? That is not, that's the whole asset that a publisher could then retain and keep and do things with, right? And so at least in the academic journal world, that's changing. That's becoming the norm, that, having rights retention policies, funders as well supporting that, but also publishers. And then, I think the nature of the relationships of what publishers can do, it's about building trust with authors or other, creators. So if you're taking knowledge and turning it into something useful, there's still a marketplace for it potentially. So just being creative about where there are needs. I think there are ways to resolve kind of intellectual property issues and still derive economic value from those things as well. Again, I think we can have some harmonious, kind of inner workings there, but it just takes time because practically speaking, when you're running a business on a certain operating model, you can't change it overnight. I mean, that's, there are many in the community that are like, well, why not? It's the right thing to do. But that's where the rub is especially with open access, flipping journals to open access and the article processing charge model it's been slow. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's been slow, but it's hard to change it overnight and still do all the quality things that publishers, do bring value and add value to. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how to solve. I mean, I think we're on the right trajectory, and I think there will be probably what will happen is you'll see some disruption, somebody that comes in and just nails it on thinking about things differently. And then you start to see innovation from there. And then because there's some commercial interest, sometimes that can actually accelerate things because it's a competitive stance as well. So, I mean, and that's okay if it gets us to the right place, the right balance, of scholarly owned and led versus, yes, there's still some commercial interest, and that's okay.
Do you see any sort of generational challenges there as well and changes? Because I could just foresee this situation where maybe the scientific student is like all on board with open science and has kind of grown up with that, and then the older professor is just like doesn't want any of that and is like maybe hiding the research away from potential competitors. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, we've done some surveying, and it is clear that there's a little bit stronger embracing among early career researchers, and even some cases where they might land with an advisor who just it's not like there's a fundamental like disagreement about the values of science, but the way that someone is brought through the system, maybe even made a whole career on the current reward system, is just not motivated to change. And yeah, that exists, absolutely. So I think we experience quite a bit of excitement and enthusiasm among early career researchers, and I think that's where we also spend a lot of time hoping that we can support early career researchers and have them be the engine of change as well.
Yeah. And then to be the engines of change, how do we as researchers do better, do you think, at sort of communicating open science, conceptually or given the latest updates on different initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complex topic, actually. I have a hard time sometimes stripping it down, but I think that the research community in general could even take, even if you're not in a situation where you feel empowered to go whole hog into changing everything, just even dipping your toe in the water and trying to make certain things available, and within your own peer groups, kind of talking about some of the challenges or opening up elements of your research, taking some of those smaller risks and trialing it out for yourself to say, well, I posted my analysis plan and I sought feedback from the community, and did I get quality feedback? My hope is that we'll get to a place where that is becoming more normative, and it's easier to see the value of taking some of those baby steps and risks. But I think just trialing would be my recommendation. So and always happy to help folks get started in terms of what are some of the baby steps, even if you're not in a situation where you've got all the support that you feel you need. But that's a big ask, again, because there's so much pressure on careers being built on a current incentive plan that it feels like you don't have time to waste or time to invest. But I think there are some small steps that any researcher can take.
Yeah, it's hard. It feels like you do sort of seem overwhelmed, especially as a early career researcher, and maybe the open science is not necessarily on the top of mind, but yeah, it's nice if you can have some of those small, maybe lower investment steps to kind of get you in there.
Yeah, there's also, I mean, again, I mentioned grassroots communities. There's just a lot of folks who you can kind of tap into as well. And so, even if in your immediate sphere it feels like it's closed off, there are a lot of resources. And so, if you're motivated, a lot of those communities certainly very welcoming, and there's a lot of resources out there too. So, there's some other ways to get at it.
Great. Well, Lisa, when you're not driving forward the open science movement at the center, what are some of your other personal interests outside of that?
What? There's something outside of
Yeah.
that? Yeah. Because it is complex, complicated, hard work, I definitely have an interest in wine. My husband and I have run a small winery. We've been, gosh, we're going on maybe just over 10, actually closer to 15 years of being in the wine business. So that's a passion. And then I love travel. Been very lucky to be able to travel. Love hiking. And then I also would put way up there as well our two dachshunds. So we're kind of dachshund fanatics. I don't know how it happened and when it happened, but I love those little guys.
Are you team red wine, team white wine, or both?
Both. And lately it's been white wine, actually. We're getting into the spring, summer out here. So it's been white wine quite a
What's
bit.
harder, pushing forward the envelope of open science or trying to run a winery?
Oh, there's no question. The winery is like, my goodness. Yeah. No, but it's fun. As we've always said, we try to make wine that we like because if we can't sell it, we just have to drink it. So, yeah.
Is it what you thought it would be getting into it, or is it just like completely different, the learning curve?
People, I mean, it sounds very glamorous. It's
Yeah.
really like tough work, and most of it is happening, kind of in the field. So it's agricultural to begin with, and you have to have a pretty thick skin when it comes to agriculture. I have mad respect for farmers who do this, completely for a living and to serve communities because Mother Nature can be brutal, different things. There's just myriad things that can go wrong. And so it's not easy. And then, yeah, the wine business is interesting once you get in there and learn all kinds of things behind the curtain. It's quite a fascinating thing, but it's a joy too. The wine community, winemaking community is really interesting. There's actually a lot of connectedness in terms of the value system of collaboration, openness. It's not as in certain communities not as proprietary as you might think. So that's actually a
Nice.
wonderful thing.
Center for Open Wine.
Yeah, there you go. It's the next label, another side project. But yeah.
Great. Cool. Well, I have a sort of roundup tradition on the podcast, which is to ask my guests, if you could give your one piece of advice or wisdom in the area of work, productivity, health, growth, relationships, anything really. What do you think it would be and why?
Advice is so hard because I try not to overdo it on advice, but I appreciate the question. I think for me, and particularly lately, just putting things in perspective. That's a phrase that I keep coming back to. I think, as we live in an increasingly interconnected world with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of big challenges that, I think we're motivated to try to solve together. It's not easy. And you can feel like you're taking multiple steps backwards one day. But you've got to look at the arc, kind of the process and the initiative or your goals and put things in perspective. And that, for me, helps me. Just saying that phrase actually calms me down when things don't go right, or when they're going right, and you're kind of wanting to be grateful about that too. So that's just a phrase that I've come to draw on quite a bit. Easier said than done, but it somehow is helpful, especially amidst a lot of uncertainty and different things that I think, as humans, we might be apt to want to control things, but we just can't. So we've got to put things in perspective.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for what you do. I mean, this is such an exciting area, and I think more people are coming around to this idea, and this is the future. And I think we can just achieve so much more with this powerful sort of open science agenda. So really appreciate it. Where should people go if they want to sort of learn more about the work you do or connect with you online?
Yeah, you can read all about the center's activities at cos.io, or you just type in the Google Center for Open Science. And yeah, we're going on our 11th year strong, and really excited to see where it takes us. But I think there's a lot of upside to the momentum that we're building together globally. So excited and welcome anyone to reach out to us at any point.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining me, Lisa.